Greenville County, Alabama, 1921. The dirt roads were red, the air thick with dust and quiet fear. In those days, the night didn't belong to everyone. It belonged to men in white robes, riding horses that left behind silence and smoke. The Ku Klux Klan ruled through terror, and for most black families in the South, survival meant submission. It meant lowering your eyes, keeping your head down, and praying the knock on the door never came. But Thomas Avery, a black farmer and father of 3, refused to bow completely. He lived on 5 acres of stubborn land, his land, earned through sweat, not mercy. Every fence post, every seed planted was a quiet declaration of independence in a world that said he shouldn't exist as a free man. His wife, Eliza, prayed over their children each night, asking God for protection from a country that never saw them as his creation. Then came the night that changed everything. The Klan came not for vengeance, not for reason, but for reminder, to show that even a good black man with clean hands could be turned to ashes for daring to stand upright. That night, Thomas watched his home burn. And something inside him caught fire, too. Not fear, but resolve. In the Alabama of 1921, racism wasn't just a belief. It was law, culture, and custom woven into the soil itself. Greenville County was a place where the color of a man's skin decided not only where he could walk, but whether he could live to see another dawn. The sheriff's badge and the Klansman's hood often belonged to the same man, and justice was a language written only for one race. Black families like the Averys lived under a quiet siege, trapped between poverty and terror, working land they would never truly be allowed to own in peace. Thomas Avery understood this better than most. He had grown up hearing stories of men disappearing into the pine woods, their names whispered in church pews like forbidden prayers. He carried that history in his shoulders, heavy but unbroken. Every morning he rose before sunrise to tend his crops, not just to feed his family, but to prove to himself more than anyone that he could exist beyond the chains that once bound his people. His dignity was his rebellion. At night, he would sit on the porch, listening to the hum of crickets and the distant bark of dogs. The darkness in the South was never empty. It was thick with threat. He knew that at any moment the sound of horses could pierce the quiet, and the world he built could vanish in flames. Yet Thomas never left. He stayed because leaving meant surrendering the only thing the Klan could never burn: his will to stand as a free man, even in a land determined to crush him. The night it began was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that feels like the earth is holding its breath. Thomas had finished a long day of work, his hands aching, his back stiff from bending over the cotton rows. Inside the house, Eliza was humming softly as she washed the children's feet before bed, a ritual that brought her peace, even in a world without it. Thomas sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring into the tree line, thinking about the future he wanted for his children. He didn't know that future was about to turn to ash before his eyes. It started with a smell, faint at first, then growing sharper, heavier, wrong. Smoke, not from the hearth, but from the fields. He stood, quickly scanning the horizon, and then he saw them, torches flickering through the darkness like serpents of fire, weaving their way toward his land. The sound followed next, laughter, not the kind that comes from joy, but the kind that drips with cruelty and power. Thomas's chest tightened as he realized what was coming. He had heard of these visits, men dragged from homes, crosses burned into yards, and sometimes families left with nothing but cinders and grief. Eliza came to the door, her eyes wide, clutching her youngest against her chest. Thomas told her to take the children out the back door and run toward the creek, where the reeds grew tall. But she didn't move at first. She looked at him, trembling, knowing what he meant. He wasn't coming with them. He had made a choice, the fear that had lived in him for years, the kind that made him look down, that made him say, "Yes, sir," when he wanted to scream. That fear was dying tonight. The torches were closer now, the chanting louder, the clan's cruel chorus echoing through the fields. Thomas stood still for a moment on the porch, the firelight painting his face, and whispered to himself, "Not tonight, not again." The first torch landed on the porch rail with a hiss, sparks leaping into the air like angry spirits. Within seconds, the dry wood began to crackle, and the smoke curled up the walls of the Avery home, swallowing the night sky in thick, black clouds. Thomas could hear the horses now, the hooves striking the dirt in rhythm, a cruel heartbeat announcing the clan's arrival. The riders appeared through the smoke, faces hidden beneath white hoods, their eyes glowing like embers through the slits. They didn't need words to tell him why they were there. His crime was simple. He was a black man who owned land, who refused to step aside when white men demanded his field for county use. In the South of 1921, pride was a sin punishable by fire. Thomas stepped off the porch as the flames climbed higher. His heart pounded, but his hands didn't tremble. He felt no bravery, only a cold certainty, the kind that comes when a man has nothing left to lose but his name. He shouted into the darkness, his voice cutting through the chants, "You can burn my home, but you'll never burn my soul." The words startled them for a moment. No one ever spoke back. No one ever stood still. The lead clansman, tall, broad-shouldered, his hood stained with the soot of past burnings, spat on the ground and laughed. "You think your soul matters here, boy," he sneered. "This land ain't yours. It never was." But Thomas didn't move. He could feel the heat on his skin, hear the wood splitting behind him, smell the fabric of his family's life turning to ash. Still, he didn't step back. He thought of his father, a man born in chains, of his mother, who'd whispered to him that freedom was not given, it was taken. He thought of his children, hidden by the creek, watching the sky turn red and learning what it meant to have courage. And so, as the fire roared behind him, Thomas Avery did what no one expected. He took one step forward, toward them, toward the hoods, toward the hate, because a man who has already lost everything is finally free to fight. The clan riders hesitated when Thomas stepped toward them. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Their power depended on fear, the way terror could silence a man before they ever touched him. But Thomas's face in the firelight wasn't that of a man pleading for mercy. It was calm, unblinking, as if the flames behind him were lighting something far older than rage, something that had been buried beneath generations of silence. He walked until he was a few feet away from the lead rider, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, the smell of smoke and pine thick around them. For a moment, there was only the sound of fire cracking and horses snorting. Nervously, the clansman shifted in his saddle, unsettled by the absence of screams. He had seen defiance before, but never like this, never this quiet, this steady, this human. Then came the voice, deep, measured, and certain. "You can burn what I built," Thomas said, "but you can't burn who I am." It wasn't shouted, it was spoken like a prayer. That sentence pierced something in the men before him, because every one of them knew what it meant to hate a man who refused to break. The rider's hand went to his revolver, not because Thomas threatened him, but because he didn't. Violence needs fear to breathe, and Thomas had taken the oxygen out of the night. The leader pointed the gun anyway, his finger trembling slightly, and shouted, "Get back!" But Thomas didn't. He looked into that white hood, into the hollow darkness behind the eye holes, and for the first time in his life he saw not power, but weakness, the kind that hides behind masks and numbers. The shot came, a thunderous crack that split the air and echoed into the fields. Thomas felt the wind of it pass his shoulder, grazing him, but not ending him. The sound woke something deep within him, not panic but fury, pure and clean. He lunged forward, grabbing the rider by the cloak, yanking him from the saddle with a strength born of generations denied. The others shouted, chaos breaking their formation, horses rearing in fear. The fire behind Thomas illuminated the struggle, shadows of two men locked between history and survival. As the rider fell, his hood tore open, and for an instant the truth burned brighter than the flames. The man beneath was no stranger. Thomas knew that face. It was Sheriff Daniel Carter, the same man who'd shaken his hand in town 2 weeks before, promising peace if he stayed quiet. And in that moment, Thomas understood the real lie of the South, that the enemy didn't wear a hood to hide from him. He wore it to hide from himself. For a moment, the world stood still. The sound of the burning house faded into the background, replaced by the ragged breaths of two men locked in the dirt, one fighting for power, the other fighting for his soul. Thomas's fist connected with the sheriff's jaw, a sound as sharp as the gunshot that had nearly ended him. The others froze, their leader on the ground, the mask ripped open, his authority bleeding out with the dirt in his mouth. In the twisted light of the fire, Thomas could see the man's eyes, not filled with hate now, but with fear. It was the first honest thing he had ever seen in that face. For years, Thomas had wondered what kind of evil lived behind those hoods. Now he understood. It wasn't monsters who came for him. It was cowards. Ordinary men so terrified of equality that they hid behind the lie of purity. The others didn't rush to help. They looked at one another, shifting uneasily, the spell of their unity cracking under the weight of what they were seeing, their leader being beaten, not by a gang, not by a soldier, but by the very man they had come to destroy. Thomas didn't stop when he could have. Each strike was a release. Years of humiliation, every boy, every order to step aside, every threat swallowed in silence, all breaking loose at once. The man beneath him whimpered, reaching for his pistol, but Thomas grabbed it first, throwing it into the fire. Then he rose, his chest heaving, and turned toward the others. "Go on," he shouted, his voice hoarse but powerful. "Do what you came to do, but look at him first. Look at the man you follow. Look at what you've become." No one moved. The horses snorted, restless, uneasy in the smoke. The men began to retreat one by one, not in fear of bullets, but in fear of truth. The clan survived on silence, on darkness, on the myth that their victims would always kneel. But now the fire they had set revealed their own faces, ordinary and small beneath the hoods. One by one they turned their horses and vanished into the trees, their torches flickering out in the distance like dying stars. Thomas stood alone before the ruins of his home, the flames licking the sky, his skin glowing red in the light. Eliza and the children appeared through the haze, their faces streaked with ash and tears. She fell to her knees beside him, clutching his arm, whispering his name through sobs. And Thomas, still staring into the embers, finally spoke. "They burned my house," he said quietly, "but they didn't burn my name." He turned toward the horizon, the first light of dawn pushing through the smoke. The clan would come again. He knew that, but something had changed forever. That night, a fire had burned in Greenville, but it wasn't just wood and timber that turned to ash. It was fear itself. The dawn that followed was not silent. The birds didn't sing. The world smelled of ash and wet soil, the remnants of the Avery home still, smoldering in grey curls of smoke. Thomas stood barefoot in the ruin, his shirt torn, his hands blackened with soot and blood. Around him lay the remains of a lifetime, the rocking chair his father had built, the Bible his mother had read from every Sunday, the wooden spoon Eliza used to stir cornbread batter for their children, all gone, consumed by the hate that had swept through the night like a storm. Yet amid the devastation, there was something sacred about the stillness. The land was quiet, but not defeated. The same earth that had been scorched would grow crops again. The same sun that had watched the clan burn his home now rose over the ashes, indifferent but consistent. Eliza came to stand beside him, her voice trembling but strong. "What will we do now, Thomas?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for the man she had always known, steady, kind, cautious. What she saw instead was something new. There was no panic in him, no despair, only resolve, shaped by the fire like iron in a forge. He took her hand gently and said, "We rebuild. We start here, on this same ground." He looked down at the burned foundation beneath his feet. "If we leave, they win. If we stay, they'll have to look at us every day and see that they failed." Word of what had happened spread through Greenville by midday. Some black families came quietly, bringing food, water, and wood. They didn't ask questions. They simply worked beside Thomas, hammering planks, clearing debris, their silence speaking volumes. Even a few white neighbors came, poor farmers who had nothing but shame in their eyes and nails in their pockets. They knew what had been done, and though they wouldn't dare say it aloud, they came because something in them had cracked too. The sheriff didn't return. His deputy rode by once, slow and distant, watching the rebuilding from the edge of the road, but he said nothing. He knew better now. That afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point, Thomas drove the first new post into the soil, the same ground where his house had burned. Each strike of the hammer echoed like a declaration. "I am still here. My family is still here." Eliza and the children worked beside him, their hands blistered but unyielding. The clan had meant to destroy a home. Instead, they had created a monument, one built not of wood and nails, but of defiance. And in that moment, under the scorching Alabama sun, Thomas Avery became more than a farmer. He became a symbol, proof that the spirit of a man cannot be lynched, burned, or silenced when he refuses to surrender his humanity. Within days, the story began to travel beyond Greenville's borders. It moved like wind through the cotton fields, whispered in churches, retold on porches, carried by men and women who spoke in hushed tones, but with rising pride. "Did you hear about the man who stood up to the Klan?" they'd ask. "The one who didn't run?" Every retelling added weight to the name Thomas Avery, transforming him from a farmer into a symbol. For a people long denied the right to fight back, his act became a spark, dangerous, beautiful, necessary. Even as the ashes cooled, the town began to shift. The white men who had ridden with the Klan started avoiding his road. They spoke of him in half-whispered warnings, their laughter absent now, replaced by a quiet unease. Fear, once a weapon they owned, was slipping through their hands. The local paper tried to bury the truth. The official report read, "Negro home destroyed in accidental blaze, sheriff injured while assisting." But no one believed it. The lies couldn't smother what everyone had seen. A man who refused to kneel, a hood torn from the head of the law itself. Thomas didn't care what the paper printed. He cared that his children had seen him stand, that they had watched their father face monsters and still draw breath the next morning. It was a lesson no school could teach, that dignity is not something you wait to be given. It's something you defend, even when the world calls it suicide. By the end of the week, other families began to build differently. Crosses that once marked fear were now being burned away by courage. The blacksmith down the road, old Henry Willis, left his door open late into the night, hammering iron louder than ever, a sound that traveled for miles, like a heartbeat of defiance. At the church, Pastor Rowland's sermons began to change. He no longer preached about turning the other cheek. He spoke of turning toward one another. The community that had been scattered by fear began to tighten like a fist, and in the center of that gathering strength stood Thomas Avery, quiet, steadfast, still scarred by smoke but alive. Yet beneath the new hope, a darker current stirred. Men who had ridden away that night did not forget their humiliation. Shame in such hearts does not turn to repentance. It turns to a rage. The clan began meeting again, this time in deeper woods, planning not another warning but a reckoning. They could not allow a black man's courage to infect others. They spoke of teaching Greenville a lesson, one that would bury not just Thomas, but the story of him. But what they didn't understand was that the story had already escaped their grasp. It had taken root in hearts that could no longer be intimidated. And even if they killed the man, they couldn't kill the fire he'd lit. By late summer, the tension in Greenville hung heavy as the heat itself. The clan no longer rode through town openly, but everyone could feel their eyes from behind the curtains, from the steps of the courthouse, from the wooden pews where they pretended to pray. Farmers whispered about new meetings in the pine woods. Strange wagons were seen at night carrying crates that didn't sound like tools. The sheriff hadn't been seen since the burning, his wound healed but his pride in ruins. In his place, a new deputy, younger and meaner, had begun making rounds, asking questions, staring too long at Thomas's rebuilt home. It was clear the town was waiting for something to happen, as if the air itself was holding its breath again. Thomas knew it too. He could feel it each morning when he stepped out to the fields. The wind didn't move the same way. It carried the unease of men plotting in darkness. But he didn't tell Eliza. He wouldn't let fear return to that. A house. Every swing of his axe, every row of crops he planted was an act of defiance. He had rebuilt the walls stronger, thicker, and added a small hidden cellar beneath the kitchen floor, not for himself, but for his children, in case the devils came again. At night he sat on the porch with a rifle across his knees, not out of hatred but duty. "If they come," he told his eldest son, "you take your mama and your sisters and run to the creek. Don't look back. The fire won't touch you." Twice! His son didn't answer. He only nodded, the same quiet strength in his young eyes that had burned in his father's that terrible night. But resistance doesn't grow quietly. The courage of one man always forces others to choose, to join him or destroy him. One afternoon, Thomas went into town for supplies. The usual stares followed him, but something was different. Conversation stopped when he passed. The butcher didn't meet his eyes. Even the pastor, who had once thanked him privately for his bravery, crossed to the other side of the street. It was the look of people waiting for a storm and pretending it wasn't there. As he left the general store, a small folded note was nailed to the post where he tied his horse. It bore no name, just 5 words scrawled in black ink. "Midnight. The flames return again." Thomas read it once, twice. His pulse didn't quicken, but his jaw set tight. He folded the note, placed it in his pocket, and walked home under the blazing sun. That night, he didn't sleep. He kissed each of his children's foreheads as they dreamed, memorizing their faces in the dim light. Eliza tried to speak, but he only said, "Whatever happens, you remember this. They can't own the night if we stop being afraid of it." And as darkness fell over Greenville once more, Thomas Avery took his place on the porch, the rifle resting across his lap, the memory of fire behind him and the promise of it ahead. Midnight came wrapped in silence, the kind that presses against the chest until breathing feels like a crime. The moon was thin and sharp, its pale light cutting across the fields like a blade. Thomas sat on the porch, the rifle balanced on his knees, his back straight as the shadows deepened. The crickets had gone quiet, a sure sign that something unnatural was moving through the trees. Then he heard it, the faint rhythm of hooves on hard ground, distant but steady, the same sound that had haunted his dreams. Since that terrible night, he closed his eyes for a moment, whispering a single prayer under his breath, not for deliverance, but for strength. The first figures emerged from the tree line, torches burning low, their robes ghostly white against the black sky. There were fewer this time, but they rode with purpose. The wind carried their murmurs, curses, threats, the language of men who mistake cruelty for courage. Thomas rose slowly, his shadow stretching long across the yard. The riders stopped at the edge of his field, the smell of kerosene drifting in the air like a prophecy. The lead man dismounted, his hood drooping in the humidity, and called out, "You should have left, Avery. You were warned." Thomas didn't answer. The man stepped forward, pulling the hammer of his revolver back. "You got one last chance to make this right," he said. "You kneel, and maybe we let your family live." Thomas's voice was calm when it came. "You had your chance to be men," he said. "You came back as ghosts." He lifted the rifle and aimed, his eyes steady on the leader's chest. For a moment, no one moved. The fire crackled between them, the air thick with smoke and pride. Then the man raised his gun, and the night exploded. The first shot split the silence, echoing through the hills. Horses reared, men shouted, the torches swung wild. Thomas fired again, and one of the riders fell, screaming as his robe caught fire. The others panicked, not expecting resistance, not from a man they thought broken. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood, shattering glass. Inside, Eliza clutched her children in the cellar, praying over the noise above. The fight was short, chaotic, and brutal. When the smoke cleared, the yard was littered with broken torches and blood-stained soil. 3 riders lay motionless. The rest had fled into the darkness, their courage drowned in fear. Thomas stood in the doorway, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, breathing hard, but still upright. His house stood again, scarred but standing, just like him. He didn't smile, didn't shout. He simply lowered his weapon and looked toward the horizon, where the first faint light of dawn was beginning to rise. The night had come to claim him twice, and twice it had failed. When the smoke settled and the last hoofbeats vanished into the pines, a strange stillness filled the air. It wasn't peace. It was the pause that follows violence, when the world seems to hold its breath before deciding what comes next. Thomas's shoulder bled steadily, staining his shirt a deep rust color, but he hardly noticed. He leaned against the porch post, the rifle still warm in his hands, his heart beating slow and heavy like a drum echoing across time. Inside, the faint sound of sobbing rose from beneath the floorboards. "It's over," he called softly, his voice trembling for the first time that night. The trapdoor creaked open, and Eliza emerged with the children, eyes wide with terror and awe. They looked upon their father not as a man anymore, but as something larger, a figure carved out of smoke and defiance, standing between them and the darkness that had tried to devour them twice. Eliza ran to him, pressing a rag against his wound, whispering prayers through tears. "You can't keep doing this," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of both love and fear. "They'll come again, Thomas. They'll never stop." He looked at her, exhaustion heavy in his eyes, and answered, "Then neither will I." Those words weren't bravado. They were a promise, a weary acceptance of the road he'd chosen. There was no going back to a quiet life. The world had changed the moment he stopped bowing his head. His stand had given his people something the clan could never reclaim, the sight of a black man who refused to break. But it had also made him a target, not just of the men who rode at night, but of the system that protected them. By morning, the deputy rode up the dirt path, his uniform dusty, his eyes cold. He looked at the bodies still lying in the yard, then at Thomas. "You're under arrest," he said flatly. "No trial, no evidence, just the law doing what it had always done." Thomas didn't argue. He handed the rifle to Eliza, kissed her forehead, and said, "Keep them safe." As the deputy led him away, neighbors began to gather at the edges of the field. Black, white, poor, silent. None dared speak, but every one of them understood what they were witnessing. They weren't seeing a criminal led to town. They were watching a man carry the weight of his people's courage. That night, as word spread that Thomas Avery had been jailed for disturbing the peace, candles began to appear in windows all over Greenville's Black Quarter. Dozens at first, then hundreds. One by one, tiny flames flickered in the dark, not torches of hate this time, but lights of remembrance, of unity, of resistance. From her porch, Eliza watched the glow spread across the hills like a slow-burning dawn. For the first time since the fire, she smiled through her tears. The Klan had tried to erase a man, and instead, they had lit a movement. The jail in Greenville was little more than a stone box that smelled of rust, sweat, and stale whiskey. Thomas sat on the cold floor, his shoulder bandaged with a strip of torn cloth. The cell was small enough that when he stretched his legs, his heels brushed the opposite wall. Outside, he could hear the low murmur of men, voices too calm to belong to strangers. He recognized them, merchants, farmers, the mayor's brother, and one man who always sat on the front pew of the church on Sundays. They were talking about him, debating quietly whether the law should handle what the Klan had failed to finish. In their eyes, Thomas wasn't just a man who'd shot back. He was a symbol that needed to be extinguished before courage became contagious. Hours passed, the light through the narrow window dimming, until only the sound of the crickets kept him company. He thought of Eliza and the children, wondered if the deputies had left them alone. He knew that by dawn, rumors would spread like wildfire, some calling him a murderer, others a hero. But none of that mattered to Thomas. What mattered was the truth. He had protected his family, and he had not knelt. That truth was a seed, and even if he didn't live to see it grow, it would take root somewhere. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross his youngest daughter had carved for him years ago. He held it tightly, feeling the grooves of her small knife marks, each one imperfect and beautiful. Sometime before dawn, the door creaked open. Sheriff Daniel Carter stepped inside, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The same man Thomas had unmasked in the firelight now stood before him without the robe, but still, cloaked in arrogance. "You've caused me a heap of trouble, Avery," he said, his tone flat, almost tired. "You think you changed something out there? You didn't. Men like me have been running this county long before you were born, and will be here long after." Thomas looked up slowly, his voice low but steady. "Then you'll be here to watch it fall." The sheriff's jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked as if he might strike him, but instead he turned toward the door. "You won't make it. To trial," he said quietly. "Things happen to men like you in the night." When the door slammed shut, Thomas leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. He wasn't afraid. Somewhere outside, he could almost hear the faint hum of voices rising in the distance. Hymns from the small church on the hill. His people were praying, and he could feel it. Each note, each whispered name, was a shield. If they came for him before morning, they would not find a man begging. They would find a man who had already won. For even in that dark cell, bound by the same system that had enslaved his ancestors, Thomas Avery was freer than any man who wore a hood. They came for him just before dawn, 4 men, faces covered, boots muffled against the dirt floor. The key turned in the lock, and the cell door groaned open. Thomas did not rise. He knew this moment the way a tree knows the coming of a storm. Inevitable, ancient, familiar. The men said nothing as they dragged him out into the yard, behind the jail. The world was still grey with early light, mist curling low over the grass. A single oak tree stood there, its branches heavy and silent witnesses to countless unspoken horrors. But this morning, the wind was different. It carried the scent of rain and something deeper, the kind of stillness that precedes revelation. They bound his wrists, tied a rope around his neck, and threw it over a thick branch. One of the men whispered, "This is what happens to those who forget." "Their place?" Thomas looked up at them, eyes calm, unflinching. "I never forgot my place," he said quietly. "It's you who never learned yours." The youngest of the four hesitated, his hand trembling. For a fleeting second, shame cracked through the mask of obedience. He couldn't meet Thomas's gaze. The others cursed, jerking the rope tighter. The sound of the hemp stretching against bark filled the air, that low, terrible moan that had haunted the South for generations. Yet in that moment, before death could claim him, something extraordinary happened. From beyond the edge of town came a sound, faint at first, then rising, singing. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, carried by the morning wind. It was the same hymn Thomas had heard through the walls of his cell. "Ain't no grave gonna hold my body down." The men froze. The melody grew louder, closer, echoing through the streets of Greenville as black families walked toward the jail, carrying candles, crosses, and the courage that had been born from his defiance. The sun broke through the clouds, striking Thomas's face in golden light. One of the Klansmen dropped the rope, backing away, his mask hanging limp in his hand. The others followed, retreating into the fog like ghosts undone by the dawn. Thomas collapsed to his knees, gasping, the rope slipping loose. The crowd reached him within minutes. Eliza was among them, her hands trembling as she untied the last knot around his wrists. The people surrounded them, their voices still rising in that ancient song of freedom. No one spoke of revenge. They spoke of promise, of faith, of endurance, of the fire that no hatred could extinguish. Greenville would never be the same. The Klan would ride again, as hate always does, but they would never again ride unchallenged, because one man, one father, one farmer had stood when standing meant death, and in doing so, he had taught an entire people that the truest kind of resistance isn't born from rage, but from refusing to bow. That morning, as the sun climbed over the burned horizon, Thomas Avery raised his eyes to heaven and whispered, "You tried to kill my body, but you fed my spirit." The crowd fell silent, the hymn fading into the breeze. And from that day forward, the story of the black father who watched the KKK burn his home and fought back was no longer a whisper passed in secret. It was a legend, the kind that spreads across generations, reminding the world that courage can survive even in the shadow of a burning cross.